The phone ringing at 2 in the morning is never good news, but when I heard my daughter's slurred, terrified whisper begging me to save her, before the line went completely dead, my blood turned to ice. I drove my truck through the pouring rain to her wealthy in-law's estate, only to find her arrogant mother-in-law blocking the massive front door with a cold smile. She told me my daughter was not leaving. She underestimated who she was talking to. I spent 45 years inspecting commercial buildings, and I know exactly how much force it takes to shatter a custom oak door frame. When I broke through and saw my daughter lying unconscious on the marble floor, with fresh dark bruises covering her arms, I realized this was not a family disagreement. This was a rescue mission, and I was going to tear their entire world down to the foundation. If you are listening to this, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight for the people you love. I am Victor. I am 72 years old, and for most of my life I worked as a chief commercial building inspector right here in Boston. I spent decades walking through active construction sites, looking for structural flaws hidden behind fresh paint and expensive materials. You learn a lot about people when you see how they build things. You learn who cuts corners, who hides dangerous faults, and who thinks they can get away with a shiny facade. But nothing I saw in my entire career could have prepared me for the structural rot inside my own daughter's marriage. It started on a Tuesday night in early November. The rain was coming down hard, beating against the roof of my house. I was asleep when the landline on my nightstand started ringing. It was exactly 2 in the morning. I picked up the receiver and heard heavy, uneven breathing on the other end. Dad. It was Abigail. Her voice was incredibly weak, slurring so badly I could barely understand her. Abby, is that you? What is wrong? I sat up immediately, tossing the blankets aside. Dad, please come get me. Please. They are trying to. Her voice cut off abruptly, followed by a muffled thud, like the phone had been snatched from her hand or dropped on a hard floor. The line went dead. I did not call back. I did not waste a single second. I threw on my heavy work boots, grabbed my keys, and picked up my solid steel flashlight from the kitchen counter. I jumped into my pickup truck and drove straight toward Weston. Weston is one of those upscale, wealthy suburbs where the driveways are longer than most normal streets. Abigail lived there with her husband Cameron and his mother Beatrice. Cameron was a 36-year-old tech executive, one of those startup guys who was always on the cover of local business magazines. He built a software company from the ground up, and Abigail was his chief financial officer. I never liked Cameron. He was too smooth, too polished. He had the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. I pushed my truck as fast as it could safely go on the wet roads. My knuckles were white, gripping the steering wheel. Abigail was 30 years old, a brilliant, strong, independent woman. She did not scare easily. For her to call me sounding like a terrified, helpless child meant something was terribly wrong. I pulled up to their massive gated estate. The front gates were open, probably a mistake by whoever was inside, or maybe they just felt untouchable. I parked my truck right on their pristine, manicured lawn, leaving the headlights shining directly at the front of the house. I marched up the stone steps to the main entrance. It was a pair of massive custom-built French doors made of solid oak. I pounded on the wood with my bare fist. "Open this door right now!" I yelled over the sound of the rain. A few moments later, the exterior porch lights flicked on. The right side door opened just a few inches, secured by a heavy brass chain guard. Beatrice stood in the narrow gap. She was completely dressed, not in sleepwear, but in a tailored blouse and slacks, as if she had been awake and waiting. Her expression was completely cold. "Go home, Victor," she said, her tone dripping with the usual arrogant contempt she reserved just for me. "Abigail is resting. She had a rough night and she is not leaving. Open the door, Beatrice. I need to see my daughter," I demanded, stepping closer. "I told you to leave." She sneered. "This is a private matter. You are trespassing on my son's property. If you do not turn around and walk back to your rusty truck, I will call the police and have you arrested." She started to close the door, but I shoved my steel toe boot right into the gap, preventing it from shutting. Beatrice gasped in shock, demanding I remove my foot immediately. I looked her dead in the eye. I spent 45 years inspecting doors just like this one, Beatrice. I know exactly where the deadbolt housing is weakest on a custom French frame. You have about 3 seconds to unchain this door before I take it off its hinges. She laughed a dry, mocking sound. You are a crazy old man. You cannot break this. She underestimated a lifetime of physical labor. I stepped back, raised my boot, and delivered a single devastating kick, aimed precisely at the space just below the lock plate. The wood splintered instantly. The brass chain ripped clean out of the frame with a loud crack, and the heavy oak door flew open, throwing Beatrice backward onto the entryway floor. I stepped over the broken wood and rushed into the foyer. The house was brightly lit, but eerily quiet. Then I saw her. Abigail was lying unconscious on the cold marble floor near the base of the grand staircase. Her face was pale, her breathing was dangerously shallow, and her arms were completely exposed. When I dropped to my knees beside her, my heart almost stopped. Her arms were covered in fresh, dark bruises, but they were not bruises from a struggle or a fall. As I looked closer, I saw tiny grouped puncture wounds. Someone had been injecting her with something, and they had not been careful about it. Abby! I shook her gently, but she was completely unresponsive. Her skin felt clammy and unnatural. What have you done to her? I roared, turning back to Beatrice, who was now scrambling to her feet, her face pale with panic. Just then, heavy footsteps echoed from the top of the stairs. Cameron came rushing down the staircase, holding his hands up defensively. He looked panicked and completely terrified of me. Dad, please stop, he yelled frantically. You do not understand what is happening here tonight. She lost her mind completely and attacked us all. Behind Cameron stood another man. He was a tall, slender individual, wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit, holding a sleek leather medical bag. He did not look like an emergency responder or a paramedic. He looked like someone you would hire to handle discreet, expensive problems. Cameron pointed to the man. This is Dr. Montgomery, Dad. He is our private family psychiatrist. He came as fast as he could. I stood up slowly, keeping myself between them and my daughter. My hand tightened around the heavy steel flashlight. Why is a private psychiatrist here at 2 a.m? And why is my daughter unconscious on the floor with needle marks all over her arms? Cameron wiped his eyes, letting out a shaky, dramatic sob. He played the part of the exhausted, heartbroken husband with practiced perfection. It has been building for weeks, Dad. Abigail has relapsed. Her manic depression came back worse than ever, and she started using substances again. She has been out of her mind. Tonight she completely snapped. She was hurting herself, smashing things, running through the house like a wild animal. Dr. Montgomery just had to sedate her to save her life. The man in the tailored suit stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. Mr. Victor, I presume. He spoke in a low, calm voice designed to de-escalate tension. Your son-in-law is telling the truth. Abigail is experiencing a severe psychotic break compounded by chemical dependency. I had to administer a heavy tranquilizer to prevent her from doing irreversible harm to herself or others. We were just about to move her upstairs when you broke in. Cameron gestured wildly toward the adjacent living room. Just look at what she did, Dad. Look at the living room. She trashed the entire place before we could restrain her. I turned my head and looked through the wide archway into their formal living room. To the untrained eye, it looked like a scene of absolute chaos. Decorative pillows were scattered across the floor. Several pill bottles were overturned on the expensive Persian rug, with capsules spilled everywhere. A large, heavy floor lamp lay knocked over near the sofa. But I was not an untrained eye. I was a commercial building inspector. My entire brain was wired to look at a physical space and determine if the narrative matched the structural reality. When you inspect a site where an accident or a collapse has occurred, you read the debris field. The debris never lies. I stared at the living room and the lie unraveled right in front of me. First, I looked at the expensive porcelain vases on the floor. If a person was running through a room in a manic, drug-fueled rage, violently trashing the place, those vases would have been swept off the tables and shattered into 100 pieces on the hardwood. Instead, they were lying perfectly intact on their sides, carefully placed on the softest parts of the carpet. Next, I looked at the dark mahogany end tables. There was a thin layer of dust on the polished wood. If someone had violently knocked items off those tables, there would be swipe marks or chaotic smears in the dust. Instead, there were perfect, clean, circular rings where the vases used to sit, indicating they had been lifted straight up and gently set down. Finally, I looked at the pill bottles. They were arranged in a cluster near the center of the rug, but there were no indentations or scuff marks on the rug fibers around them to suggest a struggle had taken place there. The pills themselves were mostly gathered in a neat little pile rather than scattered wildly across the room by a flailing hand. This was not the aftermath of a violent psychotic break. This was a poorly staged crime scene constructed by people who had never done physical labor a day in their lives. I turned my gaze back to Cameron. His fake tears were still shining on his cheeks, but his posture was completely rigid. He was waiting for me to buy the lie. He was waiting for the old blue-collar father to be overwhelmed by the medical jargon and the wealthy surroundings. Beatrice smoothed her blouse and crossed her arms. "You see now, Victor. Your daughter needs serious professional help. We are trying to handle this quietly to protect her reputation and the company. We cannot have a scandal." Dr. Montgomery stepped closer to my daughter, holding his leather bag. "I have arranged for Abigail to be transported immediately to my private, closed-door psychiatric retreat outside the city. It is for her own safety and recovery. She needs to be in a secure facility where she cannot harm herself." The pieces snapped into place. They were trying to take her away. They wanted to lock her in a private facility where no one could see her, where no one could talk to her, and they wanted to use her supposed insanity as the excuse. I looked down at Abigail. Her chest barely moved. The dosage they had given her was incredibly dangerous. I knew that if I let that man take her out of this house, I might never see my daughter alive or sane again. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and stepped directly into Dr. Montgomery's path. "I am not going to argue with you. I am not going to debate your medical opinion. But if my daughter leaves this house tonight, she is leaving in my truck. If either of you tries to stop me, I will call 911 right now, and we can let the police and the state paramedics decide what exactly is in her bloodstream." Cameron panicked. His smooth facade cracked instantly. "Dad, you cannot call the police. The media will find out. The board of directors will panic. It will ruin everything we have built. Then get out of my way." I said, my voice low and dangerous. Cameron looked at Beatrice. They exchanged a rapid, silent glance. They knew they could not afford police intervention. Not tonight. Not with whatever they were truly hiding. Cameron reluctantly stepped back, pulling the doctor with him. I bent down and gathered Abigail into my arms. She felt terrifyingly limp as I lifted her and turned toward the shattered front door. I felt a slight movement. Abigail's right hand, which had been dangling limply by her side, twitched. Her fingers curled weakly against my chest. As I adjusted my grip to carry her out into the rain, a small, hard object slipped from inside her jacket sleeve and fell directly into my palm. I closed my fingers around it instinctively, hiding it from their view. I carried my daughter out of that house, leaving the broken door hanging on its hinges. I placed her carefully into the passenger side of my truck and buckled her in. Once I was behind the wheel, I opened my hand to see what she had managed to hide. It was a plastic key card, but it was not a standard house key. It was a heavy-duty encrypted server room access card, and the edge of it was smeared with fresh blood. I stared at it as the rain pounded against my windshield. This was not a manic episode. This was a cover-up, and whatever my daughter had discovered had made her own husband try to silence her forever. I put the truck in gear and tore out of their pristine driveway, leaving deep, muddy tire tracks across their perfectly manicured lawn. The heavy rain washed over the windshield, but it could not wash away the horrifying image of my daughter's bruised arms. I drove through the dark, empty streets of Boston, my mind racing faster than the engine. I glanced over at Abigail every few minutes. She was slumped against the passenger seat, completely motionless. Her breathing was too shallow, too quiet. I kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting gently on her shoulder, just to feel the faint rise and fall of her chest. Why would my daughter have a server room keycard hidden up her sleeve? And why was there fresh blood on it? She was the chief financial officer of her husband's tech company. She dealt with numbers, budgets, and financial projections, not physical server maintenance. Something incredibly dangerous was happening inside that company, and Cameron was willing to chemically lobotomize his own wife to keep it completely buried. I arrived at my house in the quiet working-class neighborhood where Abigail had grown up. The small, familiar house felt like a safe fortress compared to the massive, deceitful mansion I had just left. I parked as close to the front door as possible. I hurried around to the passenger side, unbuckled my daughter, and lifted her into my arms. She was incredibly light. It broke my heart to feel how fragile she seemed at that moment. I carried her inside and brought her directly to her old childhood bedroom. The walls were still painted the pale yellow she had chosen when she was a teenager. I laid her down on the bed and carefully removed her damp outer jacket. I covered her with a thick, warm quilt, making sure she was comfortable. Then I pulled up a sturdy wooden chair and sat down right next to her bed, too. I did not sleep a single second that night. I sat in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain outside and the terrifyingly slow sound of Abigail's breathing. Every hour I checked her pulse. Her skin remained pale and clammy. The heavy tranquilizer Dr. Montgomery had pumped into her veins was keeping her locked in a deep, unnatural coma. I pulled the bloody keycard from my pocket and examined it under the dim light of the bedside lamp. The blood was smeared along the edges, indicating she had gripped it tightly while she was bleeding. She had fought to keep this safe. She had endured whatever they did to her just to make sure this card left the house with her. This was her ultimate insurance policy. This was the exact proof she had been trying to secure. I wiped the blood off carefully with a damp cloth and hid the card inside a hollow space behind the baseboard heater in the room. I knew how to hide things where nobody would ever think to look. As the long hours passed, my anger hardened into something cold and deeply calculated. I thought about Cameron. I thought about the arrogant smirk he always wore, and the condescending way he spoke to me like I was a simple-minded relic of the past. He thought my 45 years of inspecting buildings made me nothing more than a foolish blue-collar laborer. He did not realize that my entire career was built on finding the structural weaknesses that dishonest people like him tried to hide. I spent my life dismantling facades and proving that pretty surfaces often concealed rotten foundations. Cameron had built a shiny tech empire, but I was going to find the invisible cracks in his concrete. I was going to tear his perfect life down piece by piece until absolutely nothing was left. The morning sun crawled through the bedroom window, casting pale shadows across the floor. I sat in the wooden chair watching my daughter. She had not moved a single inch. Her chest rose and fell with a terrifying sluggishness. I placed my fingers against her wrist, feeling her pulse. It was weak and thready. Whatever chemical cocktail that doctor pumped into her system was not a standard sedative. It was an industrial-grade tranquilizer designed to shut down a human brain completely. I gently stroked her forehead. Her skin was clammy and cold. I knew I needed a professional to look at her blood, but I could not take her to a regular hospital. If I did, Cameron would find out immediately. He had the money and connections to intercept us. I needed a private, discreet toxicologist. I was formulating a plan when the front doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the quiet house like an alarm bell. I slowly checked my watch. It was barely 8 o'clock in the morning. Nobody ever visits a house at 8 in the morning unless they are desperate. I walked out of the bedroom, pulling the door shut behind me. I moved down the narrow hallway and looked through the front window. A sleek black luxury vehicle was parked right behind my pickup truck, Cameron was standing on my porch. He wore a dark tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car. In his left hand, he held a tray with 2 large cups of artisanal coffee. In his right hand, he gripped a black leather briefcase. He looked completely rested and entirely out of place on my weathered concrete steps. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders droop. I relaxed my facial muscles, trying to look like a frightened old man overwhelmed by the situation. I unlocked the front door and opened it just a crack. Cameron immediately offered a sad, sympathetic smile that made my stomach turn. "Good morning, Dad," he said, stepping forward, so I had to open the door wider. "I know it is early, but I brought you a dark roast. I figured neither of us got much sleep last night." I accepted the coffee cup with a trembling hand, playing the part of the fragile senior citizen. "Thank you, Cameron," I mumbled, keeping my voice low and raspy. I stepped back, allowing him to enter my living room. He walked in, looking around my modest home with a subtle hint of disdain before turning his attention back to me. "How is she doing today?" he asked, gesturing toward the hallway. I shook my head slowly, looking down at the floor. She is still completely unresponsive. I do not understand what is happening to her. Cameron sighed heavily, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "I know it is hard to see her like this, Dad, but I told you last night she has been spiraling out of control for months. The manic episodes, the substance abuse, it became too much for her brain to handle. Dr. Montgomery says she needs total rest before we can even begin to think about rehabilitation." I nodded silently, letting him build his narrative. Cameron set his leather briefcase on my coffee table and unlatched the silver locks. The metallic click sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy, expensive paper. There are sticky notes pointing to various signature lines. "Dad, we have a massive problem." Cameron continued, his voice dropping to an urgent conspiratorial whisper. "Novacor is scheduled to go public next week. The initial public offering is going to put our company on the global map. But the board of directors is ruthless. If they catch even a slight whisper that my chief financial officer has relapsed into a severe drug addiction, the entire initial public offering will collapse. The investors will pull their money. The stock will tank before it even hits the market. Everything Abigail and I have built will be completely destroyed." He pushed the stack of papers across the coffee table toward me. "That is why I need you to sign these right now." He pointed to the top page. "What are these?" I asked, squinting at the dense legal text. "It is a temporary medical and financial proxy," Cameron explained smoothly. "It simply transfers her voting rights in the company over to me temporarily. It also gives me the legal authority to handle her medical committal quietly, without notifying the state health boards or the media. I can get her into an exclusive private clinic under an assumed name. She gets the elite help she desperately needs, and the company stays perfectly intact. It is the only way to save her reputation, Dad. You just need to sign on the dotted lines, and I will take the entire burden off your shoulders." I stared at the documents. The words medical proxy and full financial control jumped out at me. This was the final nail in the coffin. If I signed this paper, Cameron would have total legal control over my daughter's life, her money, and her medical care. He could lock her away in a psychiatric ward forever and strip her bank accounts bare, and nobody would be able to stop him because I would have legally given him the permission to do it. I reached out and lightly touched the edge of the paper. I let my hand shake violently, mimicking the tremors of a terrified, exhausted old man. I pulled my hand back and let out a long, defeated sigh. "Cameron, I am so tired," I whispered, rubbing my eyes. "My hands are shaking too much today. I cannot even read the fine print without my reading glasses, and my head is pounding. Just leave the papers here on the table. Let me drink this coffee and gather my thoughts. I promise I will look at them and we can figure this out this afternoon." Cameron frowned. His mask of sympathy slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing the pure, predatory annoyance underneath. "Dad, time is of the essence here. The board needs to see this proxy before the market opens tomorrow." I gave him a weak, helpless look. I know, son. Just give an old man a few hours to catch his breath. My daughter is lying in a coma in the next room. Please. Cameron forced a smile, nodding stiffly. Of course, Dad. I understand. I will come back at 3 o'clock. Just make sure you sign where the yellow tabs are. He turned and walked out the front door. The moment his luxury vehicle disappeared down the street, my trembling hands became perfectly still. I walked over to the kitchen sink and dumped the expensive coffee straight down the drain. I did not trust a single thing that man handed me. I looked at the proxy papers on the table. The timeline was now absolutely clear. Cameron was rushing to legally erase his wife before she could wake up and tell me the truth about the bloody keycard hidden in her bedroom wall. I locked the heavy front door and walked down the hallway, re-entering Abigail's bedroom. She was lying exactly as I had left her, enveloped in a deep, silent sleep. I pulled the wooden chair closer to the mattress and sat down. I needed to see what they had done to her. I gently lifted her right arm and rolled back the sleeve of her sweater. The dark purple bruises looked violent against her pale skin. But as I leaned closer, the true story revealed itself. In my work, analyzing structural damage is everything. When a column fails, you do not just look at the rubble. You look at the fracture patterns to understand how the stress was applied. I applied that logic to my daughter's arm. If Abigail had been thrashing wildly fighting off a doctor, the bruising would have been chaotic. There would be scraped contusions and erratic needle marks from a frantic struggle to sedate a moving target. But that was not what I was looking at. The bruises on Abigail's arm were concentrated in a tight, perfectly organized cluster right over her vein. Inside the dark purple circles were 3 distinct needle punctures. These were not the desperate, panicked injections of a doctor trying to subdue a violent patient. These were precise, calculated strikes made by someone who had full, unresisted access to a stationary target. They had poisoned a completely defenseless young woman. My stomach twisted with dread and fury. Cameron and his polished doctor were not treating my daughter. They were chemically incapacitating her. If I took her to a public hospital, the attending physicians would run routine drug screens. They would see the sedatives Cameron wanted them to see and document her as a psychiatric emergency. The hospital would legally notify her husband, and Cameron would swoop in to take her away. I desperately needed someone entirely outside of Cameron's wealthy sphere of influence. I dialed Dr. Arthur Wallace. Wallace was a brilliant retired toxicologist who used to run an independent diagnostic laboratory. 10 years ago, the city tried to hit him with a devastating zoning fine over a pre-existing structural violation that would have bankrupted him. I was the chief inspector assigned to his case. I spent 3 weeks digging through municipal archives to prove the city had approved the faulty blueprints decades prior. I saved his entire business, and he swore he would happily return the favor. Today was that day. He answered groggily. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I had a life-or-death emergency involving my daughter, and I needed him at my house immediately with a full blood draw kit. I stressed that he could not tell a single soul where he was going. Wallace did not ask any unnecessary questions. He simply told me that he would be there in 20 minutes. True to his word, Wallace arrived quickly. He slipped through my back door carrying a worn leather medical bag. He looked older, his hair entirely gray, but his eyes were just as sharp as I remembered. I led him straight to the bedroom. When he saw Abigail lying motionless, his professional demeanor instantly took over. He set his heavy bag down and immediately began examining her pupillary response and listening to her heart rate. I showed him the clustered puncture wounds on her arm. I explained the lie Cameron had tried to sell me about a manic episode. Wallace ran his fingers gently over the bruises and nodded grimly. His expression grew incredibly serious. You are absolutely right, Victor, he murmured, keeping his voice low. These injections were administered while she was already incapacitated. Her heart rate is dangerously depressed, and her skin temperature is dropping. Whatever they pumped directly into her system has heavily suppressed her central nervous system. I will draw several vials of blood right now to run off the grid. He prepped her arm with an alcohol swab and inserted a needle drawing 3 vials of dark blood. He labeled them meticulously and packed them into a small, insulated cooler. I will expedite the screening for heavy sedatives, synthetic paralytics, and obscure industrial neurotoxins. He promised, zipping the bag shut. I will call you the absolute second I have the complete molecular breakdown. Keep her warm and monitor her breathing. If her chest stops rising for more than 10 seconds, call an ambulance no matter what Cameron might do. I thanked him quietly and let him out the back door. The house fell silent again. I returned to the bedroom and pulled the heavy quilt higher around Abigail's shoulders. I sat back down in the wooden chair, resting my elbows on my knees, staring intensely at her pale face. My daughter was trapped inside her own mind, fighting against a chemical prison built by her own husband. About an hour after Wallace left, I noticed a subtle change in Abigail's breathing. The slow, shallow rhythm began to hitch. Her fingers twitched against the quilt. I leaned forward instantly, placing my hand softly over hers. "Abby," I whispered, hoping she could hear me through the heavy fog of the drugs. "Dad is right here now. You are safe. You are in your old room." Suddenly her eyes fluttered open. Her pupils were dilated so completely that her eyes looked almost entirely black. She stared up at the ceiling for a frantic, disoriented second before her gaze locked onto my face. The sheer, unfiltered terror in her expression was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. It was a look of pure, primal panic. She lunged upward with a startling burst of adrenaline, gripping the front of my flannel shirt with trembling fingers. Her knuckles turned white from the force of her grip. Her mouth opened, but at first only a dry, raspy wheeze escaped her throat. She pulled me closer, her eyes darting wildly toward the closed bedroom door, as if she expected Cameron to burst through the solid wood at any second. The algorithm, she choked out, her voice barely a broken whisper. Her breathing was erratic and labored. "Cayman, do not let him sign." I froze completely, holding her steady. "What algorithm, Abby? What are you talking about?" She shook her head weakly, her strength already draining away rapidly. "The money," she gasped, her grip on my shirt beginning to slip. "He is taking it all. Cayman accounts. Please, Dad, do not let him sign the proxy." Before I could even ask another question, a violent shudder ripped through her entire body. Her back arched sharply against the mattress, and her eyes rolled backward. She seized for 5 agonizing seconds, her hands dropping helplessly from my shirt. Then the terrible tension vanished. She collapsed back into the pillows, completely limp, and slipped back into the depths of the chemically induced coma. I sat frozen in the quiet room, my heart hammering a relentless rhythm against my ribs. The bloody keycard hidden behind the baseboard suddenly made terrifying sense. This was never about a mental breakdown. This was a massive financial conspiracy. Cameron was using the medical proxy to steal an absolute fortune and lock my daughter away forever. I retrieved the bloody plastic keycard from behind the baseboard heater where I had hidden it. The hard edges of the plastic felt heavy in my palm. My daughter had risked her life to smuggle this out of that mansion. I knew I had to find out exactly what it unlocked before Cameron returned at 3 o'clock to force my signature on that proxy. I grabbed my keys and my heavy flashlight, leaving the house quietly, while Dr. Wallace promised to keep a close eye on Abigail. The morning commute traffic was just starting to build as I drove toward the financial district. Abigail's tech firm Novacor occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek glass and steel high-rise downtown. I parked my truck in a public garage 2 blocks away. I pulled my dark canvas jacket tight against the morning chill and walked toward the building. The front lobby would be fully staffed with security guards and required biometric sign-ins. I could not risk walking through the front door and triggering an alert that would notify Cameron of my arrival. But Cameron forgot one crucial detail when he chose that specific building for his corporate headquarters. I was the chief inspector who approved the final structural permits for that high-rise 15 years ago. I knew every single inch of that property. I walked down the narrow service alley behind the building, bypassing the loading docks. There was a secondary commercial fire escape designed for emergency maintenance access. It was heavily secured with a magnetic lock system, but those systems always had a manual physical override in case of a total power grid failure. I found the discrete utility panel bolted to the brick wall. I used the flat end of my flashlight to pry the metal casing loose. I reached inside and manually tripped the pneumatic release valve. The heavy steel door clicked open with a quiet hiss. I slipped inside and began the long climb up the concrete stairwell, avoiding the main elevators completely. My boots echoed softly on the concrete as I climbed 20 flights of stairs. My old knees ached with every step, but the image of my daughter's bruised arms pushed me forward. When I reached the 22nd floor, I eased the stairwell door open and stepped into the quiet, carpeted corridor of Novacor. The office was mostly empty at this hour, with only a few early employees wandering near the break room. I moved silently down the hall toward the executive wing. Abigail's office was located at the far end, secured behind a frosted glass door with a heavy electronic keypad. I pulled the keycard from my pocket. I wiped the remaining traces of dried blood on my jacket and slid the plastic through the card reader. The light on the scanner blinked green and the heavy door unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside, quickly closing it behind me. The office was dark, the blinds pulled tightly shut. Before I could reach for the light switch, I heard a sudden, frantic rustling sound coming from behind the large mahogany desk. Someone was hiding back there. I gripped my heavy steel flashlight, raising it defensively. "Show yourself," I demanded, keeping my voice low and authoritative. A young man slowly stood up from behind the desk. He looked to be in his mid-20s, wearing a rumpled hooded sweatshirt and wire-rimmed glasses. He was trembling visibly, clutching a silver laptop to his chest like a shield. His eyes darted from my face to the heavy flashlight in my hand. "Please do not hurt me," he stammered, taking a nervous step backward. "I am just junior IT. I am not supposed to be in here." I lowered the flashlight slightly, but kept my posture imposing. "I am Victor's father," I said bluntly. "Abigail is my daughter. Who are you and what are you doing hiding in her private office?" The young man's eyes widened in shock. The sheer panic on his face slowly melted into a look of absolute relief. "You are Abigail's dad," he whispered, letting out a long breath. "My name is Leo. Abigail hired me last year. She is the only reason I have this job." "Where is she? Is she okay?" "I have been trying to call her all night, but her phone goes straight to voicemail." I studied his face carefully. My years of inspecting contractors taught me how to spot a liar. Leo was not lying. He was genuinely terrified for my daughter. I stepped closer, placing the flashlight on the edge of the desk. "Abigail is not safe right now," I told him. "Cameron and his private doctor drugged her heavily. She gave me this key card right before she lost consciousness." I held up the plastic card. When Leo saw it, his jaw dropped. He rushed forward, staring at the card as if it were a holy relic. "You have the cold storage key," he said, his voice shaking with disbelief. "I thought Cameron got his hands on it. If he did not get this card, then we still have a chance." "A chance for what, Leo?" I asked firmly. "What is on this card, and why is my daughter fighting for her life over it?" Leo set his laptop on the desk and quickly began typing. His fingers flew across the keyboard with nervous energy. "You need to understand what happened last night, Victor. At exactly 2:15 in the morning, the overarching system administrator initiated a catastrophic protocol. Cameron ordered a complete remote wipe of Abigail's entire server network. Every single financial record, every email, every projection she had been working on for the past 6 months was digitally incinerated. 2:15 in the morning. That was exactly 5 minutes after I kicked down the front door of their mansion, while I was screaming at Beatrice in the foyer. Cameron must have been frantically executing the deletion command from his phone upstairs before rushing down to play the concerned husband. Why would he wipe his own chief financial officer's servers, I asked. Because she found the truth, Leo explained, turning the laptop screen toward me. Novacore is a complete fraud, Victor. The software we are supposedly preparing to take public next week does not actually work. The revenue numbers are completely fabricated. Cameron has been funneling millions of dollars from initial investors into a massive shadow account. It is a giant Ponzi scheme, and it is going to collapse the second we go public. I stared at the lines of code and financial discrepancies flashing across Leo's screen. Abigail figured it out, I murmured, realizing the full scope of the danger she was in. She found out 3 days ago, Leo nodded, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. She came to me because she needed someone she could trust to bypass Cameron's security protocols. She compiled every piece of evidence, every fraudulent wire transfer, every fake revenue report. She was putting together a massive dossier to hand over to the federal authorities to blow the whistle on the entire operation. But Cameron realized she was pulling the data. He panicked. He initiated the remote wipe to destroy the evidence before she could leak it. But he missed something, I said, holding up the keycard. Leo nodded frantically, pointing to the plastic card in my hand. That is the offline physical backup key. Abigail was smart. She knew Cameron monitored the cloud servers, so she downloaded the compiled evidence directly into a localized cold storage drive in the basement. It is totally disconnected from the internet. The remote wipe could not touch it. But that drive is protected by military-grade encryption. That keycard in your hand is the only physical object on the planet that can decrypt and unlock the evidence. If Cameron gets that card, the proof is gone forever, and he gets away with stealing $50 million. I felt a cold wave of realization wash over me. Cameron did not just want to commit my daughter to an asylum to silence her. He needed to incapacitate her so he could tear her house apart looking for this exact card. If I had not broken down that door when I did, he would have found it. He would have destroyed the evidence, stripped her of her legal voting rights through the proxy, and left her rotting in a psychiatric ward for the rest of her life to ensure she could never testify against him. We need to access that cold storage drive right now, I told Leo. We need to copy that data before Cameron realizes I have the key. Leo swallowed hard, adjusting his glasses. The drive is in the sub-basement, Victor. But there is a problem. Cameron upgraded the building security last week. The elevator to the sub-basement requires his personal biometric scan to operate. We cannot get down there without him. I let out a low rumbling laugh that surprised the young technician. I picked my heavy steel flashlight back up from the mahogany desk and looked at the terrified kid. Leo, I said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I was inspecting commercial building elevator shafts before Cameron was even born. We do not need his fingerprints to get into the sub-basement. We just need gravity and a little bit of structural leverage. Grab your laptop. We are going to war. I knew a bloody plastic keycard and a wiped server were not enough to stop a billionaire with a corrupt doctor and a fabricated medical narrative. If I went to the authorities now, it would just be an old blue-collar worker's word against a wealthy, influential executive. Cameron would bury me in legal fees and spin a story about a grieving father who lost his mind. I needed undeniable physical proof of what he was hiding. I needed to know exactly where the stolen money was going and how he planned to frame my daughter. I knew Cameron and Beatrice were attending a charity gala downtown. It was a massive event for local tech executives, and Cameron would never miss an opportunity to pose for cameras and pretend to be a dedicated philanthropist. The mansion would be empty. But getting inside a $40 million smart home surrounded by motion sensors, cameras, and biometric locks was supposed to be impossible for me. Cameron did not realize his impenetrable fortress was no mystery to me. 10 years ago, before Cameron was a tech billionaire, he was just an ambitious developer building a custom home in Weston. I was the chief commercial building inspector for that entire district. I personally reviewed and approved the structural blueprints for that exact property. I knew every load-bearing wall, electrical conduit, and blind spot in the architectural layout. I went downstairs and pulled out a heavy plastic storage bin filled with old municipal zoning copies and structural drafts. I spread the large blue schematics across my kitchen table, smoothing out the creased edges. I traced my calloused finger along the intricate grid lines of the mansion. Cameron had spent a fortune on external security cameras and reinforced doors, but he contracted the lowest bidder for internal drywall and secondary electrical grounding. That was his fatal mistake. I packed my canvas tool bag with extreme precision. I did not bring a crowbar or sledgehammer because brute force is useless against intelligent engineering. Instead, I packed heavy-gauge copper wire insulated rubber pliers, a small thermal scanner, and a specialized mechanic stethoscope I usually use to listen for water pressure leaks inside solid walls. I put on a dark sweater and my softest work boots. I drove my truck to Weston, but did not park on the street. I parked a half-mile away, behind a dense line of pine trees, near a public utility access road. The evening air was cold, and heavy rain from the previous night left the ground soft and muddy. I walked through the dark woods, moving deliberately and keeping my breathing steady. When I reached the edge of Cameron's property, I crouched low, watching the massive house glow against the night sky. The perimeter was guarded by high-definition motion tracking cameras. Security companies always install cameras based on aesthetic symmetry rather than overlapping coverage. Looking at the blueprint memorized in my mind, I knew exactly where the intersection of the two rear patio cameras failed to meet. It was a narrow 3-foot-wide blind spot, running alongside the stone retaining wall of the back terrace. I slipped into that invisible corridor, pressing my back flat against the cold, wet stone, sliding sideways until I reached the utility door. The utility door was solid steel, reinforced with a biometric fingerprint scanner and a magnetic lock. Most people would look at that and give up. Biometric scanners draw power from an active low-voltage electrical circuit. If you overload the grounding wire, you force the system to default to its absolute baseline safety setting. For commercial fire code compliance, a fail-safe must physically release the magnetic lock so people do not burn alive in a sudden power surge. I wrote that fire code amendment 15 years ago. I pulled out a flathead screwdriver and wedged it under the plastic housing of the fingerprint scanner, snapping the protective cover off. The tiny red and green wires were exposed. I took my roll of heavy-gauge copper wire and attached one end to the metal framing of the door, bridging it directly to the green grounding wire on the internal circuit board. I used insulated pliers to pinch the connection tight. The scanner sparked briefly, letting out a high-pitched electronic whine. A second later, the heavy magnetic lock clicked open with a soft, reassuring clunk. I pulled the door open and stepped into the dark utility corridor, closing the heavy steel silently behind me. I was inside. The air conditioning hummed softly, pushing cool air through the massive house. I clicked on my flashlight, keeping the narrow beam pointed low toward the baseboards. I did not need to search randomly. I was not looking through desk drawers or under mattresses. I was looking for structural inconsistencies. People who hide millions of dollars do not use standard floor safes. They use the architecture itself to conceal their darkest secrets. According to original municipal blueprints, there was a major discrepancy in the square footage of the basement level. The architectural draft showed a load-bearing span of 40 feet, but the finished wine cellar only measured 36 feet across. There was a hollow 4-foot gap of dead space intentionally built behind the expensive mahogany wine racks. I navigated quietly through the dark, empty hallways, making my way down the grand spiral staircase into the sprawling, climate-controlled basement. The wine cellar was massive, filled with thousands of bottles resting in custom wooden cradles. I walked to the far back wall, tapping my knuckles lightly against the drywall between the wooden racks. The first 3 taps produced a dull, solid thud, indicating the concrete foundation was directly behind the plaster. But when I moved to the 4th panel positioned directly behind a rack of imported red wines, the tap echoed with a distinct hollow, resonant ping. This was exactly what I was looking for. I knelt down and carefully examined the base of the massive wine rack. The polished wood looked permanently secured to the floor, but the thick, decorative trim at the bottom was attached with concealed magnetic clips instead of standard finishing nails. I slipped my flathead screwdriver under the wooden trim and popped the panel off, revealing a steel hinge mechanism hidden completely out of sight. I gripped the solid edge of the heavy wine rack and pulled firmly. The entire massive section swung outward on silent greased hinges, acting like a giant hidden door masking a secret. A rush of stale, dry air washed over my face. I aimed my flashlight directly into the pitch-black void. I had successfully uncovered a narrow hidden corridor, exactly 4 feet wide, lined entirely with reinforced fireproof drywall. I stepped inside, pulling the heavy wine rack closed behind me, hiding myself perfectly. The secret corridor was narrow and smelled faintly of fresh drywall. I clicked on my flashlight, keeping the beam pointed toward the floor. This hidden passage ran parallel to the main ducts servicing the ground floor. It was a developer trick to create discreet maintenance access. For my purposes tonight, it was the perfect listening post. I walked down the passage until I reached the main ventilation junction. The ductwork branched off directly into Cameron's private study and the living room. I set my tool bag down and pulled out 2 microscopic audio transmitters. They were military-grade devices Leo procured for me earlier that afternoon. I carefully removed the ventilation grate securing the study duct. Reaching my arm into the shaft, I attached the first transmitter to the lip behind the vent cover. I repeated the process for the living room duct. Those devices would pick up every whisper and transmit the audio directly to a secure server. Now I would hear every lie they plotted. With the surveillance bugs in place, I turned my attention to the main objective. I walked to the end of the hidden corridor, where the drywall dead-ended into a solid concrete foundation block. Mounted into the concrete was a massive steel wall safe. This was not a standard lockbox you buy at a hardware store. This was a heavy-duty, commercial-grade vault manufactured specifically to withstand extreme heat, physical drilling, and explosive impact. Most thieves would look at this safe and turn around. But I was not a thief. I spent my adult life evaluating the structural integrity of complex mechanical systems. I knew that every machine, no matter how sophisticated, had a critical point of failure. You just needed to know how to listen to the metal. I knelt on the concrete floor and pulled a digital thermal scanner from my bag. Cameron was an arrogant man, but he was also a creature of habit. He likely opened this safe within the last few hours to review his assets before his gala. I powered on the scanner and aimed the lens at the heavy steel keypad. The digital display illuminated with a faint blue glow. As I adjusted the contrast, a faint heat signature appeared. The residual body heat from his fingertips had left microscopic thermal impressions on 4 specific buttons. I memorized the 4 numbers and set the thermal scanner aside. Knowing the numbers was only half the battle. I still needed the exact sequential combination. I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out my mechanic's stethoscope. It is a specialized tool designed to diagnose internal engine friction or high-pressure water leaks deep inside solid concrete walls. Tonight, I was going to use it to listen to the tumblers inside the electronic locking mechanism. I pressed the cold metal earpieces into my ears and placed the tip of the probe firmly against the steel plate right next to the keypad. I held my breath, closing my eyes to block out all visual distractions. The house was completely silent, allowing me to focus entirely on the microscopic acoustic feedback from the vault. I slowly began to press the 4 numbers in various combinations. With each press, I listened intensely for the tiny mechanical click of the internal actuator pins. The first 3 combinations yielded a dull, dead sound. The machine was rejecting the sequence. But on the 4th attempt, pressing the numbers in descending order, I heard a sharp, distinct metallic snap echoing through the stethoscope. The acoustic resonance was completely different. It was the sound of a primary retaining pin dropping perfectly into its housing. I turned the heavy steel handle downward. The locking bolts retracted with a deep, satisfying thunk. I pulled the heavy vault door open. The interior of the safe was surprisingly organized. White-collar criminals like Cameron do not hoard physical money. They hoard information. I pulled out my phone, making sure the flash was disabled. I reached into the vault and pulled out a thick, black leather binder. I began photographing every single page. The first section contained detailed banking records from offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. The accounts were shielded behind anonymous shell companies, but Cameron's signature was printed on the master ledger. The documents showed $50 million systematically drained from Novacor operating funds and parked in those hidden accounts. Leo was right. Cameron had been running a massive Ponzi scheme, and the money was staged for his grand escape. I flipped to the next section. My stomach turned as I read the headers. They were fraudulent clinical trial reports and falsified revenue projections designed to deceive the initial public offering investors. Cameron had created an elaborate financial fantasy, and he planned to leave Abigail holding the bag when the structure collapsed. He was going to frame my daughter for the missing $50 million. The most horrifying discovery was waiting in a slim red folder at the bottom of the safe. I pulled it out and opened it with trembling hands. It was a single sheet bearing the official letterhead of Dr. Montgomery's private psychiatric clinic. I read the document and felt a cold, terrifying rage wash over my entire body. It was a formal psychiatric committal order. It declared Abigail a permanent danger to herself and society, citing severe, irreversible manic psychosis and violent drug addiction. The document granted the clinic absolute legal authority to hold her indefinitely against her will. At the bottom of the page, sitting right above Dr. Montgomery's signature, was a blank line designated for the medical proxy. It was pre-signed by the doctor. The date on the document was marked for tomorrow morning. The absolute evil of their plan was perfectly clear. Cameron was not going to wait to see if Abigail recovered. He would force me to sign that proxy document tomorrow morning. The second my signature touched that paper, he would execute the committal order. Abigail would be forcefully transferred to Dr. Montgomery's private asylum before the sun went down. She would be locked in a room heavily sedated and stripped of all communication rights. Cameron would then use his proxy power to finalize the $50 million wire transfer to the Cayman Islands. He would publicly blame the missing company funds on his unstable, drug-addicted wife fleeing the country with his mother, while my daughter spent the rest of her life in a chemical prison. They had orchestrated the perfect crime, but they made one catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed I was just an exhausted old man who would blindly sign whatever they put in front of me. They did not know I was standing inside their hidden vault, photographing the very documents that would send them all to federal prison for the rest of their miserable lives. I carefully placed the folders back into the safe, exactly as I had found them. I pushed the heavy steel door shut and spun the lock, erasing all evidence of my intrusion. I slipped back into the dark, hidden corridor, ready to set my trap. I navigated the basement, making sure my footsteps made absolutely no sound on the concrete. I bypassed the biometric locks using the same grounded circuit trick and stepped out into the cold, rainy night. The air felt heavy in my lungs, but my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. I made my way back through the pine trees to my parked truck. I had the photographs on my phone and the physical keycard in my pocket. Now I needed to put the pieces together with someone who understood the financial web Cameron had woven. I drove to a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city. It was a worn-down place with flickering fluorescent lights and cracked vinyl booths. Leo was already sitting in the back corner, gripping a mug of black coffee like a lifeline. Sitting across from him was a woman in a sharp, dark trench coat. She had an intense, calculating look in her eyes. Leo introduced her as Agent Torres. She was a senior investigator for the Securities and Exchange Commission. Leo had reached out to her anonymously a few days prior, when Abigail first started compiling the evidence. Now she was sitting in a cheap diner at 4 a.m, waiting to see if an old building inspector had the missing piece to taking down a $50 million corporate fraud. I slid into the booth next to Leo and placed my phone flat on the laminated table. I brought up the photographs I had taken inside the hidden wall safe. Agent Torres leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she scrolled through the images of the offshore bank accounts and the falsified clinical trial reports. I also placed the bloody plastic keycard on the table right next to my phone. Leo let out a shaky breath when he saw it. He immediately pulled a portable decryption drive from his backpack and connected it to his laptop. He inserted the keycard and typed in a sequence of commands. The screen flashed blue for a tense moment before a massive directory of files appeared. Abigail had categorized everything perfectly. She had mapped out every single fraudulent wire transfer, every fake revenue projection, and every dummy corporation Cameron had set up in the Cayman Islands. Agent Torres watched the screen with a mixture of professional awe and deep disgust. She explained that the Securities and Exchange Commission had been quietly monitoring Novacor for months, but they lacked the internal hard evidence to secure a federal warrant. Cameron had built a brilliant facade. He was paying off early investors with money from new investors, masking the entire operation as explosive tech growth. It was a classic Ponzi scheme, but executed with Silicon Valley sophistication. But the financial fraud was only half of the nightmare. I showed Agent Torres the final photograph I had taken inside the safe. It was the psychiatric committal order pre-signed by Dr. Montgomery. When Leo read the document, his face drained of all color. He looked at me with sheer panic. He explained the exact timeline of Cameron's master plan. Abigail was the chief financial officer. When the company went public, the federal auditors would scrutinize every single ledger. The Ponzi scheme would inevitably be exposed. Cameron needed a scapegoat. He needed someone to take the fall for the missing $50 million. Abigail had discovered the discrepancy and confronted him. That was her fatal mistake. Instead of fleeing immediately, Cameron and his mother devised a plot to permanently silence her and steal the money at the exact same time. They poisoned her with the veterinary paralytic to simulate a violent manic breakdown. They hired the corrupt psychiatrist to legitimize the false narrative. The only thing they needed now was my signature on that medical proxy. The second I signed that paper, I would be handing Cameron total legal authority over Abigail's life. He would use the proxy to authorize the transfer of the stolen $50 million directly into his untraceable offshore accounts. The sheer cruelty of the plan made my blood run cold. Agent Torres folded her hands on the table and outlined exactly what would happen tomorrow morning if Cameron succeeded. He would use the proxy to frame Abigail for the entire embezzlement scheme. He would present the forged psychiatric records, claiming she stole the money in a drug-fueled manic state. Because she would be heavily sedated and locked inside Dr. Montgomery's private asylum, she would never be able to defend herself in a court of law. She would be declared legally incompetent. Every single detail had been meticulously orchestrated to ensure Abigail took the entire blame while they walked away utterly clean and extraordinarily wealthy. It was a brilliant master stroke of absolute evil. They had calculated every potential vulnerability in their scheme, except for one massive oversight. They had profoundly underestimated a father's willingness to protect his child. They assumed that because I wore faded denim jackets and drove an old rusted pickup truck, I would simply nod along to their sophisticated corporate vocabulary. They believed my lack of a modern college degree equated to a lack of fundamental intelligence. It is a common mistake made by arrogant men who confuse academic credentials with practical street smarts. I had spent 4 decades reading structural blueprints, negotiating with corrupt municipal contractors, and breaking down complex mechanical systems. I knew how to observe, analyze, and deconstruct problems. Cameron had built a very impressive house of cards. Cameron and Beatrice would immediately board a private flight to Geneva, leaving my daughter to rot in a chemical prison while they lived like royalty on $50 million stolen dollars. The transfer was scheduled to execute the moment the market opened tomorrow morning. I looked at the digital clock on the diner wall. It was 4:45 in the morning. Cameron had told me he was coming to my house at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to collect my signature. We had less than 11 hours to completely dismantle his empire. Agent Torres asked if I wanted to pull the plug right now. She said she could call a federal tactical team to raid the mansion before sunrise based on the decrypted files. But I shook my head. A raid right now would give Cameron a chance to call his high-priced lawyers. He could post bail, destroy secondary evidence, and drag the trial out for years while Abigail suffered. I wanted him caught red-handed executing the fraudulent transfer. I looked at Leo and asked him if he could build a digital trap. A trap that would use Cameron's own arrogance against him. I did not just want to stop my son-in-law. I wanted to bury him permanently under his own lies. He thought my daughter was just a stepping stone for his wealth, and he thought I was just a senile obstacle he could push aside. He was about to find out exactly what happens when you threaten the child of a man who knows how to demolish foundations. I drove back to my house through the quiet Boston streets. The rain had stopped, but a thick fog blanketed the working-class neighborhood where I lived for 40 years. I parked my truck and walked inside, locking the deadbolt. The house was completely silent. Dr. Wallace left a note confirming Abigail was resting in the guest bedroom. Her breathing normalized slightly, and the dangerous chemical cocktail was filtering out of her system, but she was still deeply asleep. I walked into the dark kitchen and sat at the small wooden table. I unzipped my tool bag and pulled out the encrypted audio receiver Leo had configured. It was a small device with a digital display and heavy headphones. I plugged the receiver into the wall and placed the heavy headphones securely over my ears. I powered the device on and waited. For the first few hours, there was nothing but the faint static hum of the empty mansion. The microscopic bugs I planted inside their ventilation shafts were working perfectly, picking up the ambient noise of the central air conditioning. I sat staring at the blank wall, letting the profound weight of the night settle over my shoulders. At exactly 6:15, the green indicator light on the receiver spiked. I reached forward and adjusted the volume dial. The distinct sound of heavy wooden doors opening echoed through my headphones. Footsteps clicked sharply against the marble foyer floor. Cameron and Beatrice had returned from their high-profile charity gala. I heard the rustle of expensive fabric and the heavy thud of Cameron's leather briefcase hitting the kitchen island. I closed my eyes, visualizing their living room, focusing entirely on the audio feed. I heard the unmistakable sound of a crystal decanter opening, followed by the light liquid splash of liquor being poured into 2 glasses. They were celebrating. My daughter was fighting for her life in a chemical coma, and these 2 monsters were pouring themselves a drink to toast their success. I took a sip of the drink, Beatrice said, her voice clear through the hidden transmitter. "You look entirely too stressed, Cameron. Relax. We have won. The hard part is completely over." I heard Cameron let out a long breath, followed by the clinking of crystal. "I am not stressed, Mother," he replied, his voice dripping with pure arrogance. "I am just calculating the timeline. The market opens in less than 3 hours. I need that proxy signed and uploaded to the legal server before the board of directors calls their morning meeting. If that old man drags his feet, this whole operation gets incredibly complicated." Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sent a shiver of absolute disgust down my spine. "Oh, please, Cameron," she scoffed. "That old fool with his dirty work boots and his cheap flannel shirts actually believed the rehab story. Did you see his face when you handed him the papers? He was practically shaking in his shoes. He is terrified, and he is stupid. He thinks you are doing him an enormous favor by taking this burden off his hands. Once he signs that proxy tomorrow morning, Abigail disappears into Dr. Montgomery's private clinic forever, and we are on a private jet to Geneva before lunchtime. Let the old man rot in his blue-collar misery." I gripped the edge of my kitchen table so hard my knuckles turned completely white. Hearing her speak about me with such profound contempt did not hurt my feelings. It simply fueled the fire burning inside my chest. But what she said next about my daughter is what truly sealed their fate. "You have to admit," Mother Cameron chuckled, his voice echoing through the wire. "Abigail really thought she had me cornered. She actually believed she could waltz into the Federal Bureau and hand over my ledgers. She is brilliant with numbers, but she has absolutely no vision. She could never understand what it takes to build an empire. I almost feel bad for her. Almost. She is going to spend the next 40 years drooling into a paper cup while we spend her money in Switzerland." Beatrice hummed in agreement. She was always too rigid, Cameron. Too obsessed with doing things the right way. You are simply taking what belongs to you. Now finish your drink and go take a shower. You have a very important performance to deliver in a few hours. You need to look like the heartbroken, exhausted husband when you go back to collect that signature. Do not give that old mechanic a single reason to doubt you. The audio feed went quiet as their footsteps faded down the hallway, heading toward the master staircase. I reached up and slowly pulled the headphones off my ears, resting them on the wooden table. I sat in the absolute darkness of my kitchen for a long time. The silence in my house felt different now. It was no longer the silence of an old man waiting for the end of his life. It was the silence of a builder calculating the exact explosive yield needed to bring down a corrupt skyscraper. When I first discovered the needle marks on Abigail's arms, my primary goal was simply to get her out of danger and report Cameron to the authorities. I wanted justice. But sitting there listening to them laugh about chemically destroying my child's brain while mocking the life of hard, honest work I had lived, my goal fundamentally shifted. I did not just want to report them. I wanted to utterly destroy them. I wanted to strip away every single piece of their wealth, their arrogance, and their freedom. I wanted them to feel the exact same helplessness they had forced upon my daughter. I looked down at my rough, calloused hands. They were the hands of a man who had built hundreds of structures across this city. Beatrice was right about one thing. I was just a blue-collar worker. But she was dead wrong to assume that meant I was weak. A builder knows that the most catastrophic collapses do not happen because of a storm outside. They happen because someone compromised the foundation from the inside. Cameron thought he held all the cards because he controlled the digital world. He thought his $50 million transfer to the Cayman Islands was a completely untouchable certainty. He totally forgot that every wireless router, every fiber optic cable, and every smart home network ultimately relies on physical infrastructure. And I completely owned the physical infrastructure. I knew how to breach his walls, how to bypass his electrical grid, and how to physically rewire his reality. I stood up from the small wooden kitchen table, pushing the empty coffee cup aside. I walked straight to the dark hallway closet and pulled out a heavy spool of specialized data cable, along with a complete set of precision splicing tools. I checked my watch. It was now rapidly nearing 7 o'clock in the cold, gray morning. I had a few hours left before Cameron expected me to hand over my legal surrender. Instead, I was preparing to hand him a massive ticking bomb. I knew that men like Cameron rarely faced true justice if they were simply reported after the fact. White-collar criminals with offshore accounts and expensive lawyers do not go to prison easily. If I simply handed Agent Torres the photographs from the safe, Cameron would immediately hire a legal team to bury the investigation. He would post bail within hours. He would claim the documents were forged or planted. He would drag the legal process out for years, while my daughter remained locked inside Dr. Montgomery's private asylum, heavily sedated and unable to testify. I could not let that happen. I needed to catch him in the absolute act of committing the crime. I needed to let him believe he had won right up until the very last second. I called Leo using the encrypted messaging application he had installed on my phone earlier that morning. He answered immediately, sounding wide awake, despite the early hour. I told him I needed a way to intercept the $50 million transfer, the exact moment Cameron attempted to execute it. I wanted the money seized and redirected to a federal evidence account, and I wanted Cameron's own computer to generate a time-stamped confession of the transaction. Leo fell silent for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what I was asking. He finally spoke, saying he could write a specialized routing script to intercept the banking protocol. He said it was highly illegal, but since Agent Torres was involved, we could route it directly to the federal authorities. But there was a massive physical obstacle. Leo explained that Cameron used a highly secured closed network inside his mansion to conduct his corporate financial transfers. The router firewall was impenetrable from the outside. The only way to inject the interception script into his system was to physically hardwire a bypass device directly into the main fiber optic junction box located inside the mansion itself. Leo told me he could build the device using a small microcomputer, but someone had to plug it into the server rack. I told him to build the device. I already knew exactly where the server rack was located. I drove back to the 24-hour diner and met Leo in the empty parking lot. The rain had started to fall again, a fine mist that clung to the streetlights. Leo handed me a small, black, rectangular box with two short Ethernet cables protruding from the sides. He looked terrified, but resolute. He explained that I needed to connect the input and output cables directly between the external fiber optic line and the primary router. Once it was plugged in, the device would automatically run the script and rewrite the destination codes for any outgoing international wire transfers. I took the small black box and placed it carefully into the deep pocket of my canvas jacket. I checked my watch. It was nearing 4 a.m. I had less than 5 hours before Cameron planned to transfer the stolen money and escape. I drove back to Weston, navigating the dark, slick roads with cold precision. I parked in the same concealed spot behind the dense line of pine trees. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the freezing mist. My old bones ached from the physical exertion of the previous night, but I ignored the pain. I walked through the dark woods, slipping past the motion tracking cameras, using the same blind spot along the stone retaining wall. I reached the steel utility door. I used my copper wire trick to overload the grounding circuit one more time. The magnetic lock clicked open, and I slipped inside the dark, quiet mansion. The air conditioning hummed softly, masking the sound of my boots on the concrete floor. I did not head toward the hidden wine cellar this time. I walked down the long utility corridor toward the primary mechanical room. When I inspected the original blueprints 10 years ago, I noted that the main telecommunications hub was housed in a climate-controlled closet right next to the central heating unit. I found the heavy metal door. It was locked with a standard commercial deadbolt. I pulled a set of lockpicks from my bag. I had learned how to use them decades ago when inspecting abandoned properties. It took me less than 40 seconds to rake the pins and pop the cylinder open. I stepped inside the small mechanical room and clicked on my flashlight. The wall was covered in complex electrical panels and thick bundles of black fiber optic cables. In the center of the wall sat a large silver server rack blinking with green and blue indicator lights. This was the digital brain of Cameron's entire empire. I approached the server rack, keeping the beam of my flashlight focused on the input ports. Leo had given me very specific instructions. I needed to find the primary external line coming from the wall and plug the interceptor directly in sequence. I traced the thickest black cable from the exterior conduit down to the main router switch. My hands were steady as I reached forward. I pressed the small plastic tab and pulled the primary cable out of the router. The green lights on the server instantly flashed yellow, indicating a loss of connection. I had to move fast before the network disruption triggered a silent alarm on Cameron's phone upstairs. I pulled the small black box from my jacket pocket. I plugged the wall cable into the input port of the device. Then I took the output cable from the device and plugged it back into the main router. The yellow lights blinked rapidly for 3 agonizing seconds. My heart pounded in my chest. If the interceptor failed, the entire network would crash, and Cameron would know someone was in the house. I held my breath, watching the blinking lights. Finally, the lights stabilized and turned a solid bright green. The network connection was restored. Leo's interception script was now successfully running silently in the background of Cameron's highly secured network. I tucked the small black box neatly behind a bundle of thicker cables, ensuring it was completely hidden from a casual glance. I stepped back and wiped a bead of sweat from my forehead. The trap was perfectly set. Cameron thought his smart home was an impenetrable fortress protecting his stolen wealth. He did not realize his own walls were now actively working against him. I left the mechanical room, locking the deadbolt securely behind me. I walked back down the utility corridor and slipped out the steel door, disappearing into the dark, misty woods. I drove back to my small house as the first faint light of dawn began to crack over the horizon. I walked into the kitchen and sat at the table staring at the blank legal proxy Cameron had left for me. I picked up a blue pen and tested the ink on a scrap of paper. I was entirely ready for the final confrontation. Cameron was coming expecting a defeated old man to surrender the life of his daughter. He would get exactly what he truly, completely deserved. The sun had barely begun to illuminate the sky when I finally picked up my phone. I sat at my small wooden kitchen table staring at the blank legal proxy Cameron had left the day before. The coffee in my mug had gone completely cold. I took a slow, deep breath to center myself. I had to deliver the performance of a lifetime. I dialed Cameron's number and waited as it rang. He answered on the third ring, his voice sharp and alert. I did not say hello. Instead, I let out a ragged, desperate sob. I forced my voice to crack, making it sound weak and entirely broken. Cameron, I choked out, letting the tears leak into my words. I cannot handle her. I cannot do this anymore. She is seizing again, and she will not wake up. Please just bring the papers to the house. I will sign them. I will sign whatever you want. Just get her the help she needs before she dies. There was a brief pause on the line. I could almost hear the triumphant smile spreading across his face. When he finally spoke, he layered his voice with thick, artificial sympathy. Dad, breathe. It is going to be okay. I told you this was too much for you to handle alone. I am so sorry she put you through this, but you are doing the right thing. I will have everything ready at the house. Come over right now, and we will finalize the paperwork so Dr. Montgomery can transport her safely to the clinic. I let out another pathetic whimper, thanked him profusely, and hung up the phone. I wiped my face and stood up. The fragile old man routine was over. It was time to spring the trap. I left Abigail safely resting under the watchful eye of Dr. Wallace and drove my truck toward Weston. The morning mist was burning off, revealing a cold, bright sky. My hands gripped the steering wheel with absolute certainty. For 45 years, I inspected foundations to ensure they could bear the weight of the structures built upon them. Cameron had built his entire criminal empire on the assumption that my foundation was weak and crumbling. He was about to learn how unyielding solid concrete truly is. I pulled through the massive iron gates of his estate. They were wide open, waiting for me. I parked my old weathered truck on the pristine circular driveway right next to his sleek luxury sports car. I turned off the engine and took one final moment to steady my breathing. I stepped out of the truck and walked up the stone steps to the main entrance. The heavy custom oak door had been temporarily repaired after I kicked it off its hinges, but the deep splintered cracks were still clearly visible. Before I could knock, the door swung open. Beatrice stood in the entryway. She wore a perfectly tailored emerald green dress and a string of pearls around her neck. Her hair was immaculately styled. She looked like a woman ready to celebrate a massive victory. Her face was a masterclass in arrogance. She did not even attempt to hide her smug, victorious smile. She looked at my faded canvas jacket and my worn work boots with sheer, utter disgust. "Come in, Victor," she said, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "We have been waiting for you. It is about time you finally realized you are completely out of your depth. Abigail needs professional care, not some dirty blue-collar basement to hide in. You made the right choice. Now let us get this over with quickly so we can all move on with our lives." I kept my head bowed and my shoulders slumped, offering no resistance to her cruel insults. I followed her through the grand foyer and down the wide hallway toward the massive open-concept kitchen. The sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the pristine white marble surfaces. Cameron was sitting on a tall leather stool at the enormous kitchen island. He was completely focused on the glowing screen of his silver laptop. I could clearly see the layout of the banking software reflecting in his dark eyes. He had the international routing portals open and actively running. He was already logged into his hidden offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The $50 million wire transfer was completely staged and ready to execute. All he needed was the legal authority to press the final button without raising alarms. He looked up from the screen as I approached the island. He smoothed his tie and offered a gentle, practiced look of sorrow. "Dad, I am so relieved you called," he said, standing up to greet me. "I have Dr. Montgomery standing by on speed dial. The transport team is ready to securely move Abigail the absolute second we finish this paperwork. She is going to get the best psychiatric treatment money can buy, and you can finally go home and rest. You look terrible." You really need to take care of yourself right now. He slid the thick manila folder across the smooth marble surface toward me. He placed a heavy silver fountain pen right on top of the documents. The pages were perfectly aligned, marked with bright yellow tabs, indicating exactly where my signature was required. I stared at the paper and then looked back at the glowing screen of his laptop. The digital cursor blinked steadily next to the massive dollar amount, waiting for authorization. He thought he had completely won. He thought he was minutes away from stealing an entire fortune, framing his innocent wife, and flying away to a life of absolute luxury. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the silver pen. I let it hover over the thick white paper. The room fell completely silent. Beatrice moved closer to the kitchen island, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She tapped her polished fingernails against her arm, clearly impatient for me to finish the task. "Just sign the bottom pages, Victor," she instructed, her voice sharp. "Cameron will handle the notary stamps later today. You do not need to worry about any of those complicated details." Cameron leaned forward slightly, placing both of his hands firmly on the marble counter. He watched the tip of my pen. His eyes darted nervously between the paper and the glowing laptop screen. He was trying to act calm, but his underlying desperation was radiating from him. He needed this transaction to process before the morning bells rang on the stock exchange. He needed the stolen money fully secured in his hidden accounts. I stared down at the black ink waiting inside the pen. I thought about the sheer terror in my daughter's eyes when she woke up in her childhood bed. I thought about the poison they had ruthlessly pumped into her veins to make her look completely insane. I thought about the unyielding arrogance of the two people standing in front of me. I tightened my grip on the heavy silver pen and slowly looked up to meet his cold, dark, eager eyes. I kept my expression entirely vacant as I looked at him. I let the tip of the silver fountain pen hover just a fraction of an inch above the thick white paper. I could hear Cameron's breathing hitch slightly. He was so close to the finish line he could taste it. I slowly lowered the pen until the nib touched the signature line, leaving a tiny dark blue dot on the page. Then I stopped. I let my hand shake violently again and pulled the pen away. Cameron let out a sharp, frustrated exhale. "Dad, what is the problem? Just sign your name on the line. It will take 2 seconds, and then you can go home and rest. We have the transport team waiting for Abigail. Every minute we waste here is another minute she is not getting the medical care she desperately needs. I need to read what I am signing." "Cameron," I whispered, keeping my voice fragile and uncertain. "I am giving away my daughter's entire life. A father does not just sign away his only child without reading the terms." Beatrice let out a loud, dramatic sigh from across the kitchen island. "For heaven's sake, Victor," she snapped, her voice echoing sharply against the marble counters. "It is a standard medical proxy. Cameron is her husband. He already has the right to make these decisions, but the hospital requires this specific administrative waiver because of the severity of her psychotic break. You are making this unnecessarily difficult just to feel important." I ignored her and pulled the document closer to my chest. I adjusted my posture slightly, leaning over the pages as if my eyesight was failing me. I took my time. I read every single deliberately crafted paragraph. I read the clauses granting Cameron absolute total control over Abigail's financial portfolio. I read the stipulations allowing him to liquidate her trust funds and transfer assets to anonymous international holdings without any oversight from a legal conservator. I read the medical addendum authorizing Dr. Montgomery to place her in a closed psychiatric ward indefinitely with 0 visitation rights granted to her immediate biological family. I saw the cleverly hidden language that would shield Cameron from any future legal liability regarding her mental decline. It was a beautifully written death sentence. It was a masterpiece of legal theft wrapped up in a tidy clinical package. Every single sentence was designed to erase my daughter from existence, while ensuring her husband walked away completely untouchable. I looked up at the digital clock mounted on the stainless steel oven. It was almost 9 in the morning. The stock market was about to ring the opening bell. The federal evidence servers were fully awake, and Leo's interception script was actively monitoring the network. The trap was perfectly primed. I just needed to push Cameron to the absolute edge. I needed him to realize that his entire web of lies had been completely dismantled by the very man he thought was entirely worthless. I lowered the document and set it carefully back down on the marble counter. I placed the silver fountain pen right next to it. My hand was no longer trembling. The fragile, confused old man facade I had been wearing since I walked through his shattered front door evaporated completely. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back. I looked directly into Cameron's eyes and let the cold, hard truth settle over my features. "Cameron," I said, my voice entirely steady and deeply resonant. The tremor was completely gone. "I have a very specific medical question before I sign away my daughter's freedom." Cameron blinked in confusion. His smooth, polished exterior faltered for just a second. He was not used to hearing me speak with such absolute authority. "What kind of question, Dad?" he asked cautiously. I folded my hands together and rested them on the cold marble. "Tell me, Cameron, does scopolamine usually cause these types of severe physical seizures? Or was that violently unnatural reaction caused by Dr. Montgomery's heavy veterinary paralytic?" The silence that crashed down over the kitchen was absolute. The air in the room instantly turned to solid ice. Beatrice, who had been raising a delicate porcelain coffee cup to her lips, completely froze. Her fingers lost their grip. The expensive cup slipped from her hand and shattered violently against the marble floor. Dark, hot coffee splashed across her emerald green dress and pristine white shoes, but she did not even flinch. She just stared at me, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated horror. Cameron stopped breathing. The color drained out of his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw went entirely slack. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. He looked at me as if a ghost had just materialized in his kitchen. The realization of what I had just said slammed into his brain like a freight train. He knew exactly what those 2 specific chemicals were, because he had purchased them on the black market to poison his own wife. And he knew there was absolutely no way an uneducated old building inspector could possibly know those names unless his entire criminal conspiracy had been completely compromised. How he whispered, his voice cracking horribly. "How do you know those words?" I did not break eye contact. I leaned forward slightly, my presence dominating the space between us. "I know a lot of things, Cameron. I know about the $50 million you stole from your initial public offering investors. I know about the hidden offshore bank accounts you set up in the Cayman Islands. I know Abigail found your fake revenue projections and your fraudulent clinical trial reports. I know you paid a corrupt private psychiatrist to chemically lobotomize my daughter so you could silence her forever and escape the country." Cameron's eyes darted frantically toward his open laptop screen, where the massive wire transfer was still waiting for my signature to proceed. The illusion of his absolute control shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The smooth, arrogant tech genius disappeared instantly, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. His breathing became incredibly fast and shallow. The panicked realization that he was about to lose $50 million and spend the rest of his life in a federal prison completely broke his mind. "Shut up," he hissed violently. "Shut your mouth right now." He lunged backward, knocking his tall leather stool to the floor with a loud crash. He reached frantically into the top drawer of his custom wooden desk situated just behind the kitchen island. I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy metal scraping against the wooden interior. When his hand emerged, he was gripping a compact black semi-automatic firearm. He racked the slide with a sharp metallic clack, chambering a live round, and aimed the barrel directly at my chest. His hands were shaking so violently, I thought he might accidentally pull the trigger in his blind panic. The polished businessman was entirely gone. In his place stood a desperate, terrified criminal who realized he was completely trapped. Beatrice screamed, covering her mouth with her hands, but she did not tell him to lower the weapon. She stepped back, pressing herself against the wall, watching the scene unfold with terrified complicity. Cameron pointed the gun at me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, feral rage. "You stupid old man," he snarled, his voice completely unrecognizable. "It does not matter what you know. It does not matter what you think you found. You are in my house. You are entirely alone." He stepped around the island, closing the distance between us until the barrel of the gun was less than 3 feet from my heart. I looked at the barrel of the gun and then back up into his terrified eyes. He was completely unhinged, but I felt no fear. I had faced down much worse men than him in my long life. He kicked the manila folder across the marble counter toward me. The pages slid to a halt right in front of my hands. He grabbed the silver fountain pen and slammed it down onto the documents. "Sign the paper, Victor." Cameron screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "Sign the proxy right now and authorize the transfer. If you do not put your name on that line, neither you nor your daughter will ever leave this house alive." I did not sign the paper. Instead, I let the pen slip from my fingers. It clattered against the smooth marble surface of the kitchen island, rolling away from the fraudulent documents. For a brief second, Cameron looked confused, as if his brain could not process this minor deviation from his perfect plan. Then I started to laugh. It was not a nervous chuckle or a frail wheeze of an old man. It was a deep, booming laugh that rumbled from the very bottom of my chest, echoing loudly off the high vaulted ceilings of his luxurious kitchen. Beatrice jumped back, her eyes wide with shock. Cameron stared at me, his face twisting from desperate rage into genuine bewilderment. He tightened his grip on the heavy black firearm still pointed directly at my chest, but his hands were shaking so badly the barrel wavered. "Stop laughing!" he screamed, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. "I told you to sign the proxy, Victor. Do not make me pull this trigger. I will do it. I will kill you right here and say it was self-defense." I stopped laughing and leaned forward, resting my forearms casually on the cold marble. "You are not going to shoot me, Cameron," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and steady. "If you shoot me, you do not get the signature. If you do not get the signature, you do not get the medical proxy to legally dump your wife into Dr. Montgomery's private asylum. And if you do not get the proxy, you cannot frame Abigail for the $50 million you stole from your own company. Your entire exit strategy requires me to be alive long enough to put my name on that dotted line. You are completely trapped, and you do not even realize it yet." Cameron swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. A thin layer of cold sweat had formed on his forehead. "You do not know what you are talking about," he stammered, taking a half-step backward. "I know everything," I replied smoothly. "I know you are logged into your offshore accounts right now. I know the money is sitting in a staging portal waiting for you to execute the international wire transfer to the Cayman Islands. You think you are a tech genius, Cameron. You think you are the smartest person in this room because you know how to write software and manipulate digital ledgers. If you are so confident that you have won, why do you not prove it?" I pointed a steady finger directly at the glowing screen of his silver laptop. "Go ahead, Cameron. Hit the transfer button. Move the $50 million right now." Beatrice let out a frantic, panicked gasp. "Do not listen to him, Cameron," she shrieked, her voice shrill and grating. "He is just trying to stall us. Shoot him, and we will forge the signature ourselves. We do not have time for this game. The stock market opens in 10 minutes. Cameron did not look at his mother. His terrified eyes were locked on my face, searching for a bluff. He saw absolutely nothing but cold, hard certainty. "I am not stalling, Cameron," I urged, my tone almost encouraging. "I am giving you exactly what you want. You want to execute the transfer and walk out that door a very wealthy man. So do it. Reach over and press the button. Prove to this uneducated blue-collar worker how brilliant you truly are." His pride and his panic finally collided. He let out a primal, furious growl and shifted his weight. Keeping the gun awkwardly aimed in my direction, he reached out with his left hand and pressed his finger down hard on the execute key on his laptop keyboard. He expected a green confirmation screen. He expected the digital money to vanish into his untraceable offshore accounts. He expected to win. That is not what happened. The exact second his finger depressed the key, a sharp, piercing electronic alarm blared through the hidden speakers of the massive house. It was not a standard security chime. It was the deep, aggressive siren of a total catastrophic system lockdown. Before Cameron could even pull his hand back from the keyboard, the heavy reinforced steel security shutters installed above every single floor-to-ceiling window in the mansion dropped with a deafening, simultaneous crash. The sunlight was instantly cut off, plunging the beautiful open-concept kitchen into dim emergency lighting. The massive custom front doors slammed shut, driving heavy titanium deadbolts deep into the floor and ceiling frames. Beatrice screamed, pressing her hands over her ears as the lockdown siren wailed. "What is happening?" she shrieked, looking around the darkened room in absolute terror. Cameron dropped the gun onto the marble counter and frantically grabbed his laptop. He hammered his fingers against the keyboard, desperately trying to abort the process. The screen of his laptop did not show a successful transfer to the Cayman Islands. Instead, the display flickered violently before turning a bright, blaring red. Bold white letters materialized across the center of the monitor. Federal seizure. Routing to Securities and Exchange Commission and Federal Bureau of Investigation evidence servers. Cameron stared at those words, as if they were written in a foreign language. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He hit the escape key over and over again, but the red screen remained frozen, locking him completely out of his own administrative network. I reached out and calmly slid the heavy black firearm away from his trembling hands, dropping it safely into the deep pocket of my canvas jacket. I leaned over the marble island, bringing my face just inches from his pale, sweating forehead. "You forgot something very important, Cameron," I whispered, my voice cutting clearly through the blaring alarm. "You forgot that I was the chief commercial building inspector for this district 10 years ago. I personally inspected the wiring, the security grids, and the structural blueprints of this exact house. I know where your blind spots are. I know where you cut corners on the drywall behind your expensive wine cellar. And most importantly, I know where your primary telecommunications hub is located in the basement." Cameron slowly lifted his head. The absolute horror dawning in his eyes was the most satisfying thing I had seen in my entire life. "You did not hack me," he whispered, his voice entirely hollow. I shook my head slowly. "No, Cameron, I did not hack you. I am just a guy who knows how to use heavy-gauge copper wire and insulated pliers. I broke into your utility room at 4 o'clock this morning. My friend Leo built a specialized routing interceptor, and I hardwired it directly into your main fiber optic line. When you pressed that transfer button just now, you did not send the money to your hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands. You just sent all 50 million stolen dollars straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, completing your absolute downfall." The bright red warning flashing across the laptop screen cast a harsh glow over the pristine marble kitchen island. Cameron stared at the words, "federal seizure," as if they were physically burning his eyes. He stumbled backward, his legs suddenly giving out completely. He hit the polished hardwood floor with a heavy thud, but he did not try to stand back up. He just sat there staring at the screen while the catastrophic reality of what he had done washed over him. I stood perfectly still, watching his entire world crumble. The blaring alarm of the smart mansion continued to wail. The heavy steel security shutters kept the room sealed in dim, artificial light. Beatrice began to pace frantically around the kitchen. She looked like a trapped animal, her earlier arrogance entirely gone. She ran to the heavy oak front doors and began pulling violently on the brass handles. "Open the doors," she screamed, pulling with all her strength. "Cameron, open these doors right now. We have to leave. We have to get to the airport before they trace the transaction." She slammed her fists against the solid wood, but the titanium deadbolts remained firmly locked in place. Cameron had designed this house to be an absolute fortress, keeping the outside world away from his stolen wealth. Now that same fortress was serving as his holding cell. Then I heard it. Beneath the piercing wail of the internal security alarm, a different sound began to bleed through the heavy walls. It started as a faint, high-pitched whine echoing through the distant morning mist. Within seconds, the sound grew louder, multiplying and layering upon itself. It was the unmistakable sound of multiple police sirens approaching rapidly from the main highway. Beatrice stopped hitting the door and slowly turned around. Her eyes were wide with pure, absolute terror. She looked at Cameron, who was still sitting on the floor, shivering uncontrollably. "They are coming," she whispered. "Cameron, do something." Cameron slowly brought his hands up to his face, burying his head in his palms. "I cannot," he sobbed, his voice muffled. The routing script was physically installed in my basement mainframe. The transaction was verified through my personal biometric scanner and executed from my exact Internet Protocol address. It is a locked digital confession. I just handed them $50 million and a signed confession. The screaming sirens grew deafeningly loud, completely surrounding the property. Bright blue and red emergency lights began flashing through the tiny gaps in the heavy steel shutters, painting the dim kitchen in frantic, rhythmic colors. I heard the loud screeching of heavy vehicle tires skidding to a halt on the wet pavement right outside the front doors. Heavy tactical boots pounded against the stone steps of the front porch. Beatrice backed away from the doors, trembling violently. "They are going to break the door down," she cried, looking around for any possible escape route. "They are going to ruin my entire life." I watched her panic with absolute cold detachment. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for this woman who had happily plotted to lock my innocent daughter in a chemical prison. I checked my watch. The timing was absolutely perfect. I looked toward the long hallway that led to the utility corridor. There was no need for the federal agents to break down the front doors. When I snuck into the basement at 4 a.m. to install the interception device, I did not lock the external utility door. I deliberately left the magnetic grounding circuit open, and I sent the exact location of that unmonitored back door to Agent Torres. A sudden loud crash echoed from the back of the house as the utility door was kicked wide open. The sound of heavy tactical gear moving rapidly down the hallway filled the air. Within seconds, the kitchen was flooded with armed federal agents wearing dark tactical armor. They moved with absolute precision, fanning out across the room and securing the perimeter. Agent Torres walked in right behind them, her dark trench coat sweeping behind her. She looked around the dimly lit kitchen, taking in the scene before her. She saw Cameron sitting helplessly on the floor, and Beatrice cowering. Then she looked at me and gave a short, respectful nod. "Cameron, get up right now!" Agent Torres commanded, her voice echoing with undeniable authority. "You are under federal arrest for massive wire fraud, money laundering, and the systemic embezzlement of $50 million. Two tactical agents stepped forward, grabbing Cameron by his arms and pulling him roughly to his feet. He did not fight back. He was completely limp as they spun him around and slammed him face first against his own beautiful marble kitchen island. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists sounded like absolute music to my waiting ears. Beatrice watched her son being handcuffed, and her entire mind simply snapped. The reality of losing her wealth, her freedom, and her prestigious social standing completely broke her carefully constructed facade. She let out a piercing, guttural scream and lunged across the kitchen directly toward me. "You ruined everything," she shrieked, raising her hand to strike my face. "You ruined my family." She swung her hand with all her might, attempting to slap me across the jaw. But I had spent 45 years working with my hands building commercial structures. My reflexes were forged in physical labor. I did not even flinch. I simply reached out and caught her wrist effortlessly in midair. My grip was like a steel vise, completely stopping her momentum. She gasped in shock, trying desperately to pull her arm away, but I held her firmly. "She is not leaving, Beatrice," I whispered, repeating the exact cruel words she had spoken to me when she blocked the door the night I came to rescue Abigail. "But you are." I released her wrist as a female federal agent grabbed her by the shoulders, spinning her around and securing her wrists tightly behind her back. Beatrice began to wail, kicking her expensive shoes against the floor as she was dragged roughly toward the hallway. Her screams of protest faded as they pulled her out of the house. I watched them take Cameron next. He kept his head down, refusing to look at me as the agents escorted him away. All his stolen money was gone. Agent Torres walked over to the kitchen island and carefully closed the silver laptop, securing the primary digital evidence. She looked at me and offered a small, genuine smile. "We got the confirmation from the evidence server, Victor," she said, her voice calm. "The $50 million is fully secured and locked in federal holding. We also coordinated a simultaneous strike on the medical clinic. A secondary tactical team breached Dr. Montgomery's private asylum exactly 3 minutes ago. They caught him sitting in his office preparing the fraudulent intake documents for your daughter. He is currently being dragged out in handcuffs. The nightmare is finally over, Victor. You completely saved her life." I nodded, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace wash over me. That night, as I watched the flashing lights of the police cruisers fade down the long driveway, taking Cameron and Beatrice away forever, I finally let myself breathe. The heavy, crushing weight that had been sitting on my chest since I received that terrifying phone call at 2 a.m. began to lift. Agent Torres stayed behind for several hours, meticulously documenting the crime scene, gathering the fraudulent paperwork, and securing the hidden wall safe behind the wine cellar. She told me the federal government had everything they needed to ensure neither Cameron nor his mother would ever see the outside of a prison cell again. Dr. Montgomery was also facing severe federal charges for medical malpractice and attempted murder. Their entire polished, untouchable world had been completely eradicated by a few strands of heavy-gauge copper wire and the relentless determination of a father. The next 6 months were a slow and incredibly difficult journey, but it was a journey we walked together. Abigail's recovery did not happen overnight. The heavy industrial veterinary tranquilizers that Dr. Montgomery had pumped into her veins left her body weak and her nervous system severely compromised. She spent the first 3 weeks in a specialized rehabilitation hospital, receiving legitimate medical care from doctors we actually trusted. I sat by her bedside every single day, holding her hand and reminding her that she was completely safe. Slowly, the dark circles under her eyes began to fade. The physical bruises on her arms healed, leaving only faint scars that would eventually disappear. Her sharp, brilliant mind fought through the lingering chemical fog, and she reclaimed her strength with a fierce resilience that made me prouder than I had ever been in my entire life. When Abigail was finally discharged and cleared by her physicians, she did not retreat from the world. She faced the massive corporate disaster Cameron left behind head-on. Armed with the decrypted evidence from the cold storage keycard, she worked directly with Agent Torres and the Securities and Exchange Commission to expose the full extent of the Ponzi scheme. The $50 million that Cameron had attempted to wire to the Cayman Islands was successfully recovered from the federal holding account and systematically returned to the defrauded initial public offering investors. The board of directors, completely appalled by the depth of Cameron's corruption, unanimously voted to terminate him and strip him of all founding equity. In the aftermath of the massive scandal, the board recognized that Abigail was the only person who had the integrity and the financial brilliance to salvage what was left of the company. She was officially appointed as the new chief executive officer of Novacor. She completely restructured the entire business model, stripping away the fraudulent revenue projections and building a transparent, honest enterprise from the ground up. She rehired Leo, promoting him to head of cybersecurity, ensuring that no one could ever bypass their internal networks again. She took a broken, corrupt system and transformed it into something genuine and good. Cameron and Beatrice did not go quietly, just as I had expected. They hired a team of high-priced lawyers who immediately went on the offensive, attempting to twist the narrative to save their wealthy clients. For weeks leading up to the trial, these attorneys tried to invalidate the overwhelming physical and digital evidence we provided. They filed motions to suppress the data, arguing that an uneducated blue-collar worker could not possibly have breached a multi-million-dollar smart home without breaking the law. They tried to paint me as a trespassing senile vigilante who had planted the evidence to frame a successful tech executive out of petty jealousy. But their high-priced lawyers could not fight the sheer undeniable reality of the trap Cameron had sprung on himself. When the federal prosecutor presented the digital evidence in the courtroom, The defense's arguments crumbled into dust. The prosecution displayed the time-stamped Internet protocol logs extracted directly from Cameron's own silver laptop. The massive screen in the courtroom showed the exact second Cameron's biometric scan authorized the transaction, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that he had personally executed the illegal wire transfer. The jury watched in stunned silence as the logs traced the $50 million leaving Novacor's accounts and dropping directly into the Federal Bureau of Investigation's evidence servers, completely bypassing the Cayman Islands shell companies he had meticulously set up. The true devastating blow to their defense, however, was the physical evidence I had gathered from the hidden wall safe and the secret utility corridors. The prosecution brought out the physical offshore banking ledgers, the falsified clinical trial reports, and the fake revenue projections that Abigail had originally discovered. But the most chilling moment of the trial came when the prosecution played the hidden audio recordings I captured from the microscopic transmitters I had planted inside their ventilation ducts. The courtroom was dead silent as the ambient hum of Cameron's central air conditioning played over the speakers. Then Beatrice's cruel, arrogant voice echoed off the mahogany walls, laughing about how I was a stupid old fool who believed her lies. The jury listened in absolute horror as Cameron's own voice provided a chilling, undeniable confession of their plot. They heard him explicitly detail his intention to use the heavy veterinary paralytic to chemically lobotomize my daughter, lock her in Dr. Montgomery's private asylum, and steal her entire fortune before fleeing on a private jet to Geneva. When Abigail took the witness stand to testify against them, she did not look like the broken, sedated victim they had tried to create. She looked directly at Cameron and Beatrice, radiating strength and resilience. She meticulously explained the depths of the corporate Ponzi scheme and the sheer terror of waking up paralyzed in her childhood bed. By the time she finished her testimony, there was not a single person in the courtroom who felt an ounce of pity for the two criminals sitting at the defense table. Hearing her own son casually discuss destroying his wife's brain for $50 million stripped away any remaining facade Beatrice had left. She sat at the defense table, her face pale and sunken, staring at the floor. Cameron, stripped of his polished suits and forced to wear a standard prison uniform, kept his head in his hands. He realized that his insatiable greed and profound arrogance had been perfectly captured and weaponized against him. The jury didn't even need to deliberate for long. The physical documents, the undeniable digital logs, and the horrifying audio confessions painted a complete masterpiece of absolute evil. The judge was absolutely merciless during the sentencing hearing. Cameron received 30 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Beatrice received 25 years for her direct complicity and conspiracy to commit murder. As the bailiffs led them out of the courtroom, they both looked back at me. There was no arrogance left in their eyes. There was only the hollow, terrified realization that their insatiable greed had cost them absolutely everything. Today, the crisp autumn air feels incredibly refreshing. I am sitting on the wooden porch of my quiet, modest house in the same working-class neighborhood where I raised my family. I am holding a warm mug of black coffee, letting the bitter, familiar taste ground me in the present moment. The rusty old pickup truck is still parked in the driveway, a quiet testament to the simple, blue-collar life I have always loved and respected. I hear the soft creak of the screen door opening behind me. Abigail walks out holding her own mug of coffee. She looks healthy, vibrant, and entirely at peace. Her dark hair catches the golden morning sunlight, and she gives me a soft, genuine smile. She walks over and sits down on the wooden bench right next to me. We do not say anything for a long time. We just sit together watching the neighborhood slowly wake up. The distant sound of a lawnmower and the cheerful chatter of children walking to school fill the morning air. Abigail leans over and rests her head gently on my shoulder. I wrap my arm around her, pulling her close. The quiet peace we share in this exact moment is not just the absence of conflict. It is a profound, hard-won tranquility that was purchased with immense courage, unyielding perseverance, and the fierce, relentless protection of a father who refused to let the darkness consume his child. We survived the absolute worst storm imaginable, and we emerged stronger on the other side. I looked down at my hands, remembering the heavy steel flashlight and the broken oak door. Those hands spent a lifetime building strong, solid foundations. They worked through freezing winters and scorching summers to provide a safe, honest life. Cameron thought my age and my worn boots made me completely blind to his deception. He never understood that a man who knows how to build a house also knows exactly how to tear one down. Abigail takes a slow, deep breath, letting the crisp autumn breeze wash over her face. She is safe. She is happy. The nightmare is permanently behind us, locked away in a federal prison cell where it truly belongs. I close my eyes, feeling the warmth of the morning sun. We are finally free. Everything is going to be just perfectly fine. I spent 45 years inspecting commercial buildings, searching for structural flaws hidden behind fresh paint and expensive marble. But the most dangerous flaws are not in concrete, they are in the human heart. Greed can make people wear the mask of a loving family while plotting your absolute destruction in the shadows. Never underestimate the intuition of a parent, and never assume that age makes someone weak or irrelevant. When you threaten a father's child, he will use every single skill he has ever learned to completely dismantle your entire world down to its very foundation every single time. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you will not miss the next life stories. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Your support means everything to me today.